As 60 tons of Soviet steel screamed down Budapest's narrow alleys, students armed only with gasoline-soaked rags turned invincible tanks into iron coffins. This is the story of the night. The Iron Curtain began to bleed, and a nation of civilians challenged a superpower. Joseph Stalin stood 30 feet tall over Budapest, a bronze god of the Soviet machine, until the night of October 23rd, 1956, when the white-hot hiss of 1,000 welding torches cut him down at the knees. As his headless torso slammed into the gutter with a bone-shaking thud that vibrated through the very foundation of the city, the silence of a decade didn't just break. It exploded into 1,000,000 jagged pieces of defiance. This was the moment the shadow of the Kremlin was finally met by the light of 1,000 burning torches held by students who refused to be afraid any longer. For 10 years, the Iron Curtain had been more than a metaphor. It was a physical weight, a suffocating line of fear and suspicion that ran through the heart of the Hungarian soul, chilling the air and muting the voices of millions. It was a barrier that divided a proud people from their ancient history and their Western neighbors, replacing their millennium-old symbols with the cold, unyielding red star of the Soviet Union. But the cracks in the monolith were widening, and what began as a cautious protest in the stone courtyards of the Technical University was fast becoming a tidal wave of revolutionary fervor that would sweep the entire Eastern Bloc to the precipice of a new and terrifying reality. This uprising was not merely a political dispute. It was a desperate, visceral reclamation of an identity that had been buried under layers of forced industrialization, rigorous censorship, and ideological purity enforced by the secret police. The people were reclaiming their past, reaching back to the revolutions of 1848 to find the strength to challenge the masters of the present. The air in Budapest that evening was thick with the scent of ozone, the metallic tang of turned earth, and the raw electricity of a populace that had suddenly realized its own strength. The students had marched across the Margaret Bridge, their footfalls echoing like thunder against the iron girders, their voices rising in a rhythmic, haunting chant that demanded the return of a man who had become the unlikely vessel of their hopes, Imre Nagy. To understand the rise of Nagy is to understand the deep, structural fracture within the communist world itself. Moscow viewed any deviation from their central, rigid command as a contagious virus, a Titoist heresy, named after the defiant Yugoslav leader who had survived Stalin's assassins to walk his own independent path. Nagy was a man of the party, a lifelong communist, but one who nonetheless believed in a national identity that did not require the crushing, absolute weight of a foreign boot. He represented socialism with a human face, a concept that felt like oxygen to a drowning nation that had been starved of its own culture for a decade. But as the crowd swelled to over 200,000 people in front of the Parliament building, a sea of humanity filling Kossuth Square from the Danube's edge to the museum steps, the political reality was moving faster than any one man could hope to lead or contain. The people were no longer asking for minor bureaucratic reform. They were demanding a total resurrection of the Hungarian spirit, the immediate removal of Soviet mechanized divisions, and the restoration of the Kossuth coat of arms to its rightful place on the national flag. Even as the tricolour flag was raised into the smoky sky, a different sound began to vibrate through the ancient cobblestones. The low, rhythmic, and terrifying growl of Soviet diesel engines moving in the darkness, a mechanical heartbeat that signaled the empire's refusal to fade without a fight. Deep within the corridors of power, the frantic clatter of telegraph machines, and the ringing of heavy rotary phones signaled a crisis that the Kremlin could not ignore. The Soviet satellite system was an interlocking grid of states where any sign of independence was viewed as a mortal threat to the entire architecture of the Warsaw Pact. In Poland, a similar thaw had narrowly avoided massive bloodshed through political maneuvering, but Hungary was different. It was visceral. The resentment here was long pent up, a pressurized chamber of national pride that had been stoked by the brutal secret police, the State Protection Authority, known as the AVH. These were the men in the leather coats who made families vanish in the middle of the night, the enforcers of a regime that ruled by the shadow of the gallows and the cold concrete of the interrogation room. Their headquarters at 60 Andrassy Avenue had become a symbol of terror, a place where the walls themselves seemed to sweat with the fear of the innocent and the screams of those who refused to break. As the sun dipped below the horizon of the Buda Hills, painting the Danube in shades of bruised purple and blood orange, the first shots rang out near the radio building. The AVH guards, panicked by the sheer, unyielding mass of humanity pressing against their gates, opened fire with submachine guns from the upper windows. The first victims fell silently, their blood staining the revolutionary banners they had carried only hours before. Blood on the pavement acted as a chemical catalyst for the rage of a nation. By midnight, workers from the Chapel ironworks were arriving in hijacked trucks, bringing the heavy tools of industry, hammers, crowbars, and stolen rifles, to serve as the desperate weapons of war. If you are fascinated by these moments where the course of history shifts on a single night of fire and steel, please subscribe to this channel so you never miss a deep dive into the turning points of our world. By the morning of October 24th, 1956, the twin cities of Buda and Pest had become a labyrinth of fire, broken glass, and jagged steel. The Soviet leadership, fearing the total loss of their southern flank and the collapse of their prestige, ordered the Special Corps of the Soviet Army to enter the city with T-34 and T-54 tanks. It was a tactical blunder born of supreme imperial arrogance. The Soviet commanders believed the mere sight of heavy armor and long-barreled cannons would send the hooligans scurrying back to their tenements in terror. Instead, they found themselves trapped in a geometric nightmare. The grinding of steel tracks against narrow stone walls echoed through the urban canyons of the city like the screams of dying machines. These streets were not designed for armored maneuvers. They were designed for the urban guerrilla. Young men and women, some no older than 16, and wearing school uniforms, perched in the upper stories of apartment blocks, with crates of beer bottles filled with gasoline, the legendary Molotov cocktails. They had learned the weaknesses of these iron beasts through trial and error, the fuel tanks located on the exterior, the vulnerable engine vents, and the limited visibility of the periscopes, which forced the commanders to open their hatches just to see. When a tank entered a narrow alleyway, it became a blind giant. The first bottle would hit the engine vents to choke the air intake. The second would target the treads to immobilize the beast. And within minutes, the pride of the Soviet Armored Corps was a blackened, stinking hulk of iron, its crew forced to flee into the waiting, vengeful arms of the insurgents. This was a war of the rooftops against the road, and for the first time in a generation, the rooftops were winning. Nagy was pleading for peace on the radio, his voice shaking with the weight of the moment. But in the narrow alleys of Pest, the blind giants were already burning, and the revolution had found its teeth. The geography of the city itself became a force multiplier for the rebels, turning every corner into a fortress and every basement into an armory. The high stone buildings offered perfect cover for snipers, while the wide central squares became killing zones for any infantry unit caught in the open without heavy support. But the most significant development of the second day was the sudden and dramatic shift within the ranks of the Hungarian People's Army itself. At the Killian barracks, Colonel Pal Malata faced the ultimate, agonizing choice of a soldier: obey his Soviet-trained superiors or defend his own people against foreign aggression. He chose the latter, bringing his men, his ammunition, and his heavy equipment over to the side of the revolution. This was a turning point of immense psychological importance, as it proved the Hungarian military was no longer a tool of the occupiers. He didn't just give the rebels guns, he gave them the professional backbone, the tactical training, and the legitimacy of a nation in arms. He organized the disparate groups of students and workers into a cohesive fighting force that could hold ground against an empire. Suddenly, the Red Star was being hacked off of every building with hammers and chisels, and in its place, the Hungarian tricolour was raised with a jagged, symbolic hole cut out of the centre. This was more than a flag. It was a physical excision of a foreign ideology, a surgical removal of the Soviet emblem from the very fabric and soul of the country. The hole represented a void where oppression had been, a space that the people intended to fill with their own destiny, free from the dictates of a distant Kremlin. It was a visual declaration of independence that could be seen from the highest spires of the city to the deepest tunnels of the metro. While the street fighting raged and the smell of gunpowder hung heavy over the Danube, Imre Nagy found himself in a state of agonizing paralysis, caught between his loyalty to the party and his love for his country. He had been thrust back into the premiership by the will of the people, but his initial radio broadcasts were a desperate, almost pathetic plea for order and a return to normalcy. He was a man of the old guard, a bureaucrat by training, trying to speak to a new world that had already moved past him in a matter of hours. He was haunted by the memory of the Stalinist purges, fearful that any misstep would lead to a bloodbath even greater than the one currently staining the streets of his capital. The Soviet representatives, Anastas Mikoyan and Mikhail Suslov, watched the chaos from the heavily fortified embassy, weighing the cost of a total, bloody crackdown against the fragile possibility of a negotiated settlement that would keep Hungary within the Warsaw Pact. They were playing a dangerous game of diplomatic brinkmanship, pretending to listen while Moscow moved more divisions to the border. The dilemma was truly global and fraught with geopolitical peril. The eyes of the West were turning toward Budapest with a mixture of awe and fear, but they were also tragically distracted. The Suez Crisis was boiling over in the Middle East, drawing the attention, the resources, and the moral focus of Washington and London away from the Danube at the very moment the Iron Curtain was being shredded. This global distraction meant the rebels were alone in the dark, standing against the weight of an empire that was already beginning to reconsider its initial retreat and plan for a more permanent, devastating solution. The tragedy was that the very moment of Hungary's greatest hope was also the moment of its greatest geopolitical isolation. As the fighting reached its fourth day, the revolution began to consolidate its power and organize its government. Most of Western Hungary was now in rebel hands, and the control of the central government was tenuous at best, as local revolutionary councils replaced Soviet-appointed mayors and officials. In cities like Győr and Sopron, the transition was swift, as the old apparatus of the state simply melted away in the face of public anger. The border at Hegyeshalom, a line of fear and barbed wire for a decade, was suddenly thrown open by cheering guards who threw down their Soviet-style caps in a gesture of absolute defiance For the first time since 1945, the frontier was not a barrier, but a gateway for hope and international solidarity. From across the Austrian border, a massive convoy of Red Cross trucks, fueled by contributions from people in Britain, France, and America, rushed blood plasma, antibiotics, and food to a city that was bleeding out in the streets. Austrian Defense Minister Ferdinand Graf witnessed a sight that would have been unthinkable a week prior. Hungarian border guards and rebel soldiers working together in the mud to usher in relief supplies for their wounded countrymen. The traditional Hungarian emblems were reappearing on every gatehouse and uniform, a visual testament that a people's national pride must be respected and understood before bitterness becomes an unquenchable and permanent civil war. The sight of these convoys gave the rebels a false sense of security, a belief that the world was finally coming to their aid, and that the era of Soviet domination was over, unaware that the diplomatic landscape was shifting beneath their feet in a way that would leave them isolated when the final hammer fell. The cost of this historic defiance was written in the blood-soaked soil of towns like Magyaróvár, where the revolution met the full, unbridled cruelty of the old regime. There, a peaceful demonstration of unarmed citizens, including students, shopkeepers, and families carrying flowers and singing national songs, was met by a cold, sustained volley of machine gun fire from the hidden positions of the AVH. 85 men, women, and children were cut down in seconds, their bodies left in the dust as a grim, silent reminder of the stakes. The mass funeral that followed was a stern, silent warning to the world and a funeral dirge for the old order. The weeping of the mothers of Magyaróvár became the anthem of the revolution. The casualties were heavy on both sides, with the rebels taking a grim, methodical toll on the occupiers and their secret police enforcers in revenge for the massacres. Every death at the hands of the secret police only served to harden the resolve of the insurgents, turning a political protest into a sacred crusade for the soul of a nation. But as the rebels celebrated their temporary victories and breathed the air of a free Hungary, the shadow of a much larger, more professional Soviet force was gathering on the distant horizon, far beyond the reach of the Molotov cocktails and sniper rifles. The Kremlin was not preparing to retreat into the night. It was preparing to pivot with overwhelming, industrial-scale force. The initial intervention had failed because it was half-hearted, poorly planned, and tactically unsound. The next wave would be a coordinated, crushing, and final strike, designed to erase the very memory of defiance and re-establish the order of the Iron Curtain with a ferocity that would shock the world. The tragic victims of the 1956 uprising proved to the world that the moral power of a people could, for a brief and shining moment, stop the gears of a global superpower. It was a conflict that forced the world to acknowledge that the desire for freedom is not a political talking point or a luxury, but a fundamental human necessity as vital as air. As the traditional emblems replaced the red stars on the caps of the soldiers and the facades of the buildings, a fleeting, beautiful sense of victory washed over Budapest. The people believed they had won, that the tanks were leaving for good, and that a new era of democracy was dawning. But the cold logic of the empire remained, fueled by a fear in Moscow that if Hungary fell, the entire Soviet sphere would dissolve like a house of cards. The Soviet tanks had won the initial street battles, only to lose the heart and soul of the Eastern Bloc forever. The final act of this tragedy was yet to be written in the halls of the Kremlin, and the eerie silence of the Soviet tanks in the final days of October was not a sign of peace or withdrawal, but the terrifying quiet before a much larger, more devastating storm. What happened next would change the Cold War forever, solidify the lines of the 20th century, and leave a mark on the Hungarian heart that would last for 33 years of silent, simmering resistance and secret commemorations of those who fell. The victory was a mirage, but it was a mirage that would inspire generations to come. The story of the Hungarian Revolution is a testament to the fact that history is not merely a record of dates, but is shaped by the raw courage of those who refuse to back down, even when the odds are impossible and the world seems to have forgotten them. It reminds us that power is not just found in the barrel of a gun or the tread of a tank, but in the collective will of a people who have decided they have nothing left to lose but their chains. This was a revolution of the young, of the workers, and of those who remembered what it meant to be free. If you found this account of the 1956 uprising and the bravery of the Hungarian people insightful, please share this video with others who value historical truth and the lessons of the past. We want to hear your thoughts. Do you believe the Western powers should have intervened more directly to save the revolution, or would that have sparked an unavoidable Third World War? Let us know your perspective in the comments below. Thank you for standing with us as we explore the epic tales of human sacrifice, the complexities of war, and the enduring, unbreakable pursuit of liberty. For now, the bells of Budapest continue to ring through the fog of time, echoing a defiance that an empire could suppress, but that history can never truly erase. It is a story of a glorious defeat that eventually paved the way for a final victory.